This video goes over exercise 5C, adjustment layers. We're continuing with adjustment layers, and we're going to see how we could use multiple adjustment layers in a single file. We're going to take this image that is washed out and looks a little faded and improve its quality through a couple adjustment layers, and then we will look at the color lookup adjustment layer at the end for more of a creative effect. This exercise comes with an exercise file, so click on the link and download the file. And then you could open it up with Photoshop. As you can see, this image looks quite washed out. So let's use an adjustment layer to improve this. Layer, new adjustment layer, and we will use the levels adjustment layer. As usual, I will create the clipping mask and push OK. So the levels adjustment layer could be a little technical, but we can also just follow a simple procedure to use it in a simple manner. So just make sure you can see the properties panel, so you can click on the adjustment layer icon to bring up the properties panel. And what we see in the properties panel over here is what's called a histogram. And it's giving us an indication as to the intensity of the pixels in the image in terms of the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. So this histogram gives us an analysis of the overall image. We can see from this histogram that here in the shadows area, there's very little pixels, if not any. In the midtones, we have the majority of the pixels, so you can see the mountain that it's creating over here. The higher up you go with the histogram, the more pixels you have in that range. And then as we approach the highlights, we can see that there's a sharp drop off, and again, we have no pixels in the highlights. What this is telling us, and it helps us to understand why the image looks washed out, it's because we're lacking significant contrast between the pixels, and we don't have all of the pixels being used in the full dynamic range from black to white, from darks to highlights. So what we can do to fix this is drag these sliders. Okay, so this is a general rule of thumb that works for these types of images. If you were to take the dark slider, the shadow slider, and slide it up, and just stop right about there, right before you see pixels starting to appear in the histogram. And you can see what it did in the canvas, how we have a lot more of the darks being utilized in the photo. We can do the same thing for the highlights slider. So take the highlight slider and drag it in, and this one we don't have to go as far, just go to the point where you see some pixels starting to appear. I will stop over there because I'm satisfied with the result. And we basically changed the range of shadows to highlights in this image. And by doing that, we're kind of increasing the overall dynamic range in the photo. So we've cut out the wasted darks that are not being used, and we've moved that new 0 position to where we actually have pixels. So that's stretching out this dynamic range and giving us a much better, more contrasting image. So that's it for the levels adjustment layer. Let's go ahead and tweak the contrast a little bit. So I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and Brightness Contrast, the first one. So this could be used to adjust the brightness and contrast. And for this image, I'm simply going to increase the contrast a little bit. So if you don't see the Properties panel, just click on the Adjustment Layers thumbnail, and then you can adjust the contrast a little bit. Generally, it's a good idea to have contrast in your work. This is, of course, a subjective thing, and there are many situations where you might not want contrast. But in this case, I do think adding some contrast to this just helps it pop out a little bit more and really helps those colors stand out between the darks and the lights. So that's it for the contrast. So those are examples of adjustment layers that I've used to kind of improve the quality of the image. So just playing with the light and the contrast, the levels, we've really made a big difference to this image. So I'm going to quickly, oh, I noticed I didn't create the clipping mask. Again, as I've been saying in the previous videos, because there's only one layer, it doesn't really make a difference. But it's a good habit to get into so that your adjustment layers apply only to that layer that you're trying to modify. In situations where you want to modify all the layers in the document, if there's more than one, then you wouldn't create the clipping mask. So yes, this was an example of improving the overall quality of the image. And we can see a quick before and after if I click the eyeballs to hide the adjustment layers. And wow, what a difference. So you see how this image goes from completely washed out, and with the adjustment layers, we have a nice, vibrant image with the colors restored. Let's have a look at the color lookup adjustment layer. Layer, new adjustment layer, and color lookup. I will create the clipping mask and push OK. So this one is a little bit more creative, and it's kind of like filters. Filters that you would use, say, in Instagram, for example. So unfortunately, the filters provided by Photoshop aren't so amazing, but it's useful to know that this exists. I'll invite you to explore in the panel over here where it says 3D LUT file. So you could click on this little arrow and load up a different LUT file. And that's going to create different effects. Let's try horror blue. So you see, these could go overboard, but it is a layer, so that means you can play with opacity if you want to modify the effect a little bit. So this one will give it a bit of a bluish tint to it. And like I said, they're not all amazing. You have to know how to use them, and often, or I think if you want to get some more advanced or different kinds of filters, you'll have to go online and try to download them and open them up in your Photoshop. Regardless, this is a nice look into adjustment layers, again, for creative effects. So feel free to explore that and find an effect you're satisfied with. All right, so that's it for this exercise. We saw a couple adjustment layers to improve the overall quality of the image, and another adjustment layer for a creative effect. This is just one example of how you could use many adjustment layers in a single Photoshop document. All right, see you later.